Hi students, I just wanted to give you a preview of your next section in Stride Toward Freedom. Most of this section is actually centered on the philosophies and the philosophers who influenced Martin Luther King in his philosophy of nonviolence as a method of resistance against oppression. And I think you'll find that this section is possibly particularly difficult given the number of philosophers that are mentioned in the book and kind of the assumed knowledge that Martin Luther King thinks his readers have regarding these philosophers and the times at which they kind of espouse their different philosophies. So we're going to do a short preview that will hopefully help you understand the reading just a little bit better. So some of the major philosophers or influences in Dr. Martin Luther King's nonviolence principles were Henry David Thoreau, Walter Rauschenbusch, Karl Marx, Friedrich Nietzsche, Reinhold Niebuhr, Mahatma Gandhi, and Edgar Brightman. All of these names you'll see mentioned in this section of reading. You'll be taking notes on these different philosophers as well as along with their ideas and some of the strengths and weaknesses that Martin Luther King saw in each of these philosophers' ideas. And each philosopher provided something different for Martin Luther King to consider. And Martin Luther King, after studying and doing a lot of reading, very much held to his philosophy of nonviolence. He once said, "I plan to stand by nonviolence because I have found it to be a philosophy of life that regulates not only my dealings in the struggle for racial justice, but also my dealings with people and with my own self." One of those first philosophers that influenced Martin Luther King pretty heavily was Henry David Thoreau. And Henry David Thoreau lived between 1817 and 1862. He was a naturalist, a poet, as well as an abolitionist. In other words, he, as an abolitionist, fought against the institution of slavery. One of the major things that he is known for is his life of simplicity. He moved out to a very remote area called Walden Pond for a while and just lived off the land. He also refused to pay a poll tax to vote, and he also refused to pay taxes in general, actually, to the government. And he wrote significantly about civil disobedience, the act of disobeying laws, if he felt that those laws were unjust. And this idea of civil disobedience actually had quite a profound impact on Martin Luther King's idea of non-cooperation with unjust government and unjust laws. So some of the quotes that he is very well known for, and you'll see a picture of his house that he built in Walden Pond, was he was very much known for his simplistic way of life. He said, "I make myself rich by making my wants few." He also said, "I ask for not at once no government, but at once a better government." Some people misunderstood his act of civil disobedience as a desire to not have any government, to not have any, to essentially have anarchy. But that was not really his goal. His goal was to resist and essentially disobey laws that he felt were unjust. So when you think about Henry David Thoreau and try to predict what Martin Luther King thought of his philosophy, what do you think might be some of the strengths and weaknesses that Martin Luther King viewed in the ways that Martin Luther King might have viewed his philosophy on life? Another philosopher that was very influential for Martin Luther King was Walter Rauschenbusch, and he lived from 1861 to 1916, and he lived during the Industrial Revolution, during which time he saw a lot of injustice by industrial companies against workers. He was a minister in New York's Hell's Kitchen. He was also a professor. And some of his major ideas or writings were the theology of the social gospel and Christianity and the social crisis. And his major ideas were really centered around the necessity of the church to look horizontally or look out into society and see what they might be able to do to alleviate the problems of man, and not just look ahead to the afterlife, but to look at current and present suffering of others and figure out ways that people can be involved in society. He felt that it was very much the responsibility of the church to engage in societal problems. He was also very much an optimist about the capacity for human kindness. He felt that humans had almost an unending ability to be kind to others. And some of his most famous quotes were, "Whoever uncouples the religious and the social life has not understood Jesus. Whoever sets any bounds for the reconstructive power of the religious life over the social relations and institutions of men, to that extent denies the faith of the Master." So he felt essentially that working to better society was crucial and a vital element of one's faith. He also said the kingdom of God is not a matter of getting individuals to heaven, but of transforming the life on earth into the harmony of heaven. So he felt that one's mission in life was to actually essentially make earth more like heaven. And so what do you think might be some of the strengths and weaknesses that MLK saw in his philosophy or his ideas? How might these ideas have fed Martin Luther King's philosophy of nonviolence? Another philosopher that was very influential in Martin Luther King's life was Karl Marx. Karl Marx lived from 1818 to 1883, also during the Industrial Revolution, but in Russia. He was an economist, he was a socialist, a historian, a journalist, and some of his major ideas and writings centered around communism and socialism. And his philosophy was on the need for society to become classless. He actually saw capitalism as being an enemy of the workers, as an enemy of people, and that to remedy this, it would be best to have a classless society actually controlled mostly by the government. And he saw a great deal of danger in capitalism. He felt that capitalism promoted greed, and that led to the exploitation of the poor and workers. And some of his major ideas could probably be summed up in some of the quotes that he's well known for. He said that the theory of communism may be summed up in one sentence: abolish all private property. Workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. He also said the first requisite for the happiness of people is the abolition of religion. He also said the education of all children from the moment that they can get along without a mother's care shall be in state institutions at state expense. So again, before you read section 3 in Stride Toward Freedom, think of what MLK might have thought about these ideas. What were the strengths of Karl Marx's philosophy? What were some of the weaknesses? Another person that highly influenced Martin Luther King was Friedrich Nietzsche. He lived in 1844 to 1900 in Germany, and he saw a great deal of war. He was a professor, he was a philosopher, and he was also a war veteran. So he saw lots of horrific things during his lifetime as a result of war. Some of his major ideas and writings included Birth of Tragedy and Human, All Too Human, Beyond Good and Evil. And he was known for the idea of nihilism. And nihilism is basically an extreme pessimism and skepticism about human nature and man's capacity to do good. Some of these ideas about the capability of man to do evil might be summed up in some of his quotes. He says, "Whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process he does not become a monster. When you look long into an abyss, the abyss also looks into you. God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. You have your way, I have my way. As for the right way, the correct way, and the only way, it does not exist. So again, you can see the pessimism regarding life and human capacity to do good, as well as Nietzsche's own relativistic view of life, that there's not only one wrong way to do things or one right way to do things. So think about Martin Luther King and what he might consider some of the strengths of this philosophy and some of the weaknesses. Reinhold Niebuhr was another person who influenced Martin Luther King quite heavily. He lived from 1892 to 1971. He was a theologian, a minister, a professor, a former pacifist, as well as the founder of the International Rescue Committee, which is a refugee resettlement agency that is still operating today. Some of his major ideas and writings were moral man and immoral society, children of light, children of darkness. He actually encouraged U.S. involvement in World War II, and he was most definitely a proponent of military intervention into conflicts. He was formerly a pacifist, and World War I influenced him heavily as to whether or not pacifism was actually a reasonable solution to global conflicts. Some of his ideas are regarding man's capacity for doing good could be reflected in some of his most famous quotes. He is known to say, "Evil is not to be traced back to the individual, but to the collective behavior of humanity." He also said, "The whole art of politics consists in directing rationality, the irrationalities of men." So in that way, he felt that military intervention was sometimes the only solution to bringing about resolutions to conflict. He also said, "Man is his own most vexing or difficult problem." He said, "Original sin is that thing about man which makes him capable of conceiving of his own perfection and incapable of achieving it." He is also known very famously for the Alcoholics Anonymous prayer. "God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference." So, in reviewing Niebuhr's philosophy, what do you think might be some of the strengths that MLK took away from it in his own creation of his nonviolence philosophy, and what might be some of the weaknesses? Finally, or almost finally, Mahatma Gandhi was obviously a huge influence in Martin Luther King's philosophy of nonviolence. He lived from 1869 to 1948. He was a lawyer and an activist. Some of his major ideas and writings were satyagraha, which is soul force or love, firmness, truth, non-cooperation, the endurance of suffering as a means to an end, and he was also known very much for his direct objections to violence of any type. So he once said, "I object to violence because when it appears to do good, the good is only temporary. The evil it does is permanent." He also said, "You must not lose faith in humanity. Humanity is an ocean. If a few drops of the ocean are dirty, the ocean does not become dirty." Hitler killed 5 million Jews. It is the greatest crime of our time, but the Jews should have offered themselves to the butcher's knife. They should have thrown themselves into the sea from cliffs. As it is, they succumbed anyway in their millions. He also said, "I would like you to lay down the arms you have as being useless for saving you or humanity. You will invite Herr Hitler or Signor Mussolini to take what they want of the countries you call your possessions. If these gentlemen choose to occupy your homes, you will vacate them. If they do not give you free passage out, you will allow yourselves, man, woman, and child, to be slaughtered, but you will refuse to owe allegiance to them." So think about what strengths of this philosophy Martin Luther King might have seen. What might have been some of the weaknesses? A final philosopher is Edgar Brightman, and he was also one of Martin Luther King's professors in seminary. He lived from 1884 to 1953. He was a philosopher, a professor, and some of his major ideas and writings were that man can know God personally, and that God does intend good for the world, and that tragedies and sufferings can be used for good. He also said